Those intake tubes had some of the junk out of those cylinders down in them. It was pretty grungy looking down in there. So I took that carburetor off, figuring some of the crap got into it too. And it did. I took the carburetor over into the shop and cleaned it out and got it all cleaned out. And then I found a brush that's just the right size to fit in those intake tubes. And I started brushing that out, and I took a part sprayer, used a little bit of paint thinner in the siphon part sprayer, and sprayed those out real good, and got them cleaned out pretty good. I talked to the mechanic a little while ago. He called, and the cylinders are rebuilt, are all done, and he's going to get them on the barge on Tuesday, so they should be here Monday, a week from tomorrow. Or they'll be here a week from today, but of course the barge company doesn't open up on Sunday except to unload the barge, so hopefully they'll get them sorted out on Monday, and I'll go pick them up. And then he's going to have surgery tomorrow, and we'll find out tomorrow or after that how long it'll be before he recovers enough to come up here. Hopefully that'll be soon too. Just keep pedaling, going uphill, but we're pedaling. I was hoping once I got the airplane this far that the mechanic could be up here to help with the rest of it, to finish it up, and with his mechanical helpers we'll get the engine mounted up, and I was kind of hoping he would do all the routing and stuff of all these cables and everything while I finished up the floats. But circumstances intervened, and he's not going to be able to make it up here for a few more days. He's got to have hernia surgery today, so hopefully that turns out well, and we'll see how long it takes him before he can get up here. Well, I might as well keep working on this. Well, I can go ahead and keep plugging away on this stuff on the engine, getting it ready. And we've got stuff to hook up onto the engine. I've got wires and stuff to hook up on here. I've got to hook the primer lines up and magneto lines up and a few other things like that. What I'm doing here now is routing the starter and alternator wires. I thought I had that all figured out when I put it all together in the basement, but getting the engine up here, some of the things changed a little bit. I had these wires here for the alternator, and for the starter I had a heat shrink tubing on them to secure them all the right spot and everything, so I could just route them in here. And of course that turned out I didn't have quite enough slack on this line that comes from the voltage regulator. It needed to have a little attention on it to make it right. So that's what I'm working on now. I've got the cables coming out of here, out of the firewall, for the starter and the battery charger. This smaller cable is off the alternator that goes to the battery or charges that. And then the big cable here is for the starter. I've run those out and run a loop in them. You've got to have slack in here for this engine mount to swing. You can swing the engine mount. Technically the engine mount swings this direction. It pivots on these pins, but you can actually get it to swing either direction. So I've got a pretty good loop in there for that, and for tension release I went ahead and pulled some of this wire out here from the voltage regulator, so I've got a little more slack on that so it's not binding up and tight. Put a cable clamp here on the engine mount up here where the weld is, and here on the cable to hold that. And then there was another cable clamp down here on this lower engine mount, that tied up there. And this will go in underneath these tubes along the top of this sump, and that's where it was routed before. So I've got some heat shrink on there to hold the wires together and to protect them from abrasion as they go by this engine mount, and down here where they go across this sump. I'll put another piece on there to tie these together, this starter cable together with these, and then I'll see whether I'm going to put a cable clamp on there or what. Then this alternator cable will turn here and go over to the other side of the engine, and the starter cable will terminate right here at the starter, of course. That starter cable and the alternator cables are run. I have heat shrink on them any place that they might abrade, and I put cable clamps on them here tied into the sump where they go underneath the cylinders here, keep them in tight against that. So the starter cable, I need to cut it off to length. This is the same starter cable that was in the old airframe. The old airframe, it came all the way from underneath the floorboards behind the back seat. Now it goes in and underneath the front seat. So anyway, I need to cut that off and put a terminal end on it. I need to put terminal ends on the alternator cables to hook up to the alternator. I got the starter and the alternator hooked up. Here's the starter over here. I left that cable a little bit long and turned it and bent it and come back, so if you ever have to cut it off or something, there's enough there that I can cut it back and put another end on it if I need to. Now I took a tie wrap there. There's an eye right here, a mount hole here on this starter. I took a tie wrap and run in there and just put around that cable there just to kind of support it a little bit there. That should be plenty high enough to be up out of the way of the exhaust system and everything. And I come around over here to the alternator, and I've got it hooked up. There we go. Well, this stuff on the front of this airplane takes a pretty good beating, being exposed to the weather anyway, but this thing's out in the salt water and it gets lots of rain and splashed up salt water in here and stuff, so this front end takes a beating. This alternator gets pretty grungy. I've had to replace an alternator once because everything rusted out in here so bad. This one was pretty rusty, and when I took it apart, 3 years sitting in here, it didn't heal up. But it's not too bad. I took a wire brush and cleaned off all the terminals, all the nuts and stuff. I think a couple of nuts, well, this one here for the field, I replaced it, put a new screw in there, cleaned up the tab that screws into, and got them in there. This has got plenty of extra wire on it too. Before that came in there and was pretty short. And when you have the short wire, it puts a lot of tension on that wire. The vibration and stuff has a tendency to crack them out. And then when they do, you don't have enough on there left to fix them, to do anything with them. So I've got enough wire here that I can make repairs on that if I need to. And everything's all cleaned up and ready to go. So that's pretty nice. That'll work really good for a couple of years anyway, I hope. You can see how rusty this winding is on here. Not really anything I can do about that. Case has got some corrosion on it, some white death on it, but that's all going to be the way it is. This pulley was rusty, so that gets to have a good grip on the belt, but it has a tendency to eat the belts up. It gets rusty and gets pitted and stuff in there. So I took a wire brush on a drill motor, just a little wire brush, and turned that and cleaned it all up. And then took some Exo Rust and just squirted a little bit of Exo Rust on it to help protect it. So the battery and starter alternator wiring is done. We've got most of the stuff hooked up on the back of the engine here now. Got the oil temperature probe put in there, a new annular gasket put on that, and safety wired to tighten down, safety wired down. And the tachometer cable, I got a new tachometer cable and got that put in here. That's in, and we've got the switches, the wires for the mag switches. We've got the left mag and the right mag. Left mag is just about impossible to get to without pulling that engine out. You got to have multiple jointed, long, skinny fingers to get in there to get that one. Without that baffling on there and that oil cooler on there, this engine swung out pretty good, so it was easy to get to it. And the oil pressure hose is on. I tied these magneto wires to the firewall here with just a little clamp to kind of tidy them up a little bit so they're not hanging down too far. And there's plenty of slack on them. They can be pulled out from the firewall if need be. The clamp that I put on there is loose, so they can slide around on that. And then I've got these studs here that are welded onto the fuselage frame that hold the firewall up while you're working on it. I determined I didn't need those full length, so those are cut off. I'll have to get a file and take the sharp edges off of those, but they were sticking out there 2 inches or so. They didn't need to stick out that far. That's just something else to hang your hand up on when you're in there working on that with it tight in there behind that engine. So I'll get those cleaned up, and then the last thing I need to hook up on here, other than the carb heat mixture and the throttle controls, is the primer line. I have to go dig out an 1/8 inch flare fitting for that to fit in that block that's mounted up on the engine, and that'll finish up all of the hookups on here. I'll hoist that engine a little bit, and then this thing slides on there pretty good. I can go ahead and put those pins, those bolts back in there now, and I don't need to do anything else here, I think, on this.